Nobody believed a girl who looked barely 20 could save them. The turbulence was killing everyone. Their hearts stopped when military jets appeared. Then the F-16 commander called her by a secret name. In 3 words, "Welcome back, ma'am," passengers learned their young pilot was actually a military legend. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the airport terminal windows as passengers gathered at Gate 24 for Flight 847 to Denver. Among the usual crowd of business travelers and families, nobody paid much attention to the slender young woman walking confidently toward the gate in a crisp pilot uniform. Captain Elena Rodriguez moved through the terminal with quiet purpose, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her face fresh and youthful enough to make several passengers do a double take when they noticed the 4 stripes on her shoulders. She looked barely 25 years old, though she was actually 29, and her appearance had become both a blessing and a curse in her new career as a commercial airline pilot. After 8 years of flying the most advanced fighter jets in the military, she had chosen to step away from that world and find peace in the predictable routines of commercial aviation, but her youthful face made that transition more challenging than she had anticipated. As Elena approached the gate desk to coordinate with the ground crew, she noticed an elderly couple pointing at her and whispering to each other with concerned expressions. The woman leaned toward her husband and said loud enough for others to hear that she hoped there was a more experienced captain actually flying today because that girl looked like she just graduated from high school. Elena had heard similar comments dozens of times since joining the airline 6 months ago, and she had learned to let them roll off her shoulders without reaction. The gate agent, a friendly woman named Patricia who had worked at the airport for 15 years, gave Elena a sympathetic smile and quietly said that passengers always seemed surprised by how young she looked but that her safety record and on-time performance were actually among the best in the entire airline. Elena thanked Patricia with genuine warmth and headed down the jetway to begin her pre-flight preparations, leaving the skeptical passengers to board behind her. Inside the Boeing 737 cockpit, Elena found her first officer already working through the preliminary checklists with methodical precision. First Officer Marcus Webb was a veteran pilot in his early 50s with 23 years of commercial flying experience, and he had been assigned to fly with Elena as part of the airline's mentorship program for newer captains. Marcus was a good man with a patient teaching style, but he clearly believed Elena needed significant guidance despite her official captain status. He looked up as she entered the cockpit and immediately began explaining which weather systems they needed to watch during today's flight, pointing at the radar display and describing cold fronts and wind shear patterns as if she had never encountered difficult weather conditions before. Elena listened politely and nodded at appropriate moments, offering no hint that she had flown through conditions far more dangerous than anything commercial aviation would ever encounter, including combat missions through active war zones where enemy fire and mechanical failures created emergencies that made severe turbulence seem almost routine by comparison. Marcus continued his detailed weather briefing while Elena settled into the left seat and began her own instrument checks, her hands moving across switches and displays with unconscious precision that came from thousands of hours in military cockpits where hesitation could mean death. She verified fuel quantities, flight control responses, navigation systems, and engine parameters with quick efficiency that made Marcus pause his weather lecture to comment that she seemed very confident for someone so new to commercial aviation. Elena simply smiled and said she had received excellent training, which was technically true even if Marcus had no idea that her training had involved dogfighting enemy aircraft at supersonic speeds rather than learning passenger service procedures at flight school. The weather report showed a significant storm system developing along their route with turbulence forecasts that ranged from moderate to severe, and Marcus suggested they might want to request an alternate routing to avoid the worst areas. Elena studied the meteorological data carefully, her mind automatically calculating wind vectors, pressure gradients, and atmospheric instability patterns with the analytical precision of someone who had spent years making split-second tactical decisions in three-dimensional combat environments. Passengers began boarding the aircraft while Elena completed her pre-flight preparations, and she could see several of them glancing nervously into the cockpit when they passed by the open door. A businessman in an expensive suit stopped briefly and asked the flight attendant if that young lady was really going to be flying this plane, and when the attendant confirmed that Captain Rodriguez was indeed their pilot today, the man requested to speak with a supervisor because he wasn't comfortable trusting his safety to someone who looked like she should still be in college. The lead flight attendant, an experienced professional named Jennifer who had seen every type of passenger reaction during her career, calmly explained that all airline pilots met the highest certification standards regardless of age and that Captain Rodriguez had completed the same rigorous training as every other captain in the fleet. The businessman reluctantly took his seat but continued to mutter complaints about airlines hiring pilots who were too young and inexperienced to handle serious emergencies that might occur during flight operations. Elena heard the entire exchange through her headset but maintained her focus on the instrument panel without acknowledging the passengers' concerns. She had learned during her military service that proving herself through actions was far more effective than defending herself with words, especially when people had already made judgments based on appearances rather than capabilities. Marcus tried to be supportive by saying that passengers always calmed down once they experienced smooth professional flying, but his tone carried the assumption that Elena might actually need reassurance about handling passenger skepticism rather than recognizing that she had faced far more intense scrutiny during her military career. The boarding process continued smoothly despite the businessman's complaints, and soon the flight attendant secured the cabin while Elena and Marcus completed their final checklists and received pushback clearance from ground control. The pushback and taxi proceeded normally as Elena maneuvered the heavy aircraft through the morning traffic pattern at the busy airport. Her radio communications were crisp and professional, acknowledging clearances and following instructions with the efficiency that came naturally after years of operating in controlled airspace where mistakes could have catastrophic consequences. Marcus watched her handling of the aircraft with subtle surprise, clearly noticing that her control inputs were smoother and more precise than he typically saw from newly promoted captains who were still developing their touch with the larger commercial jets. Elena kept her attention focused on the taxiway ahead while mentally preparing for the takeoff and climb, her situational awareness extending far beyond what the instruments showed as she automatically tracked wind conditions, traffic patterns, and potential contingencies that might require immediate responses. Tower control cleared Flight 847 for takeoff on runway 27, and Elena advanced the throttle smoothly while the big turbofan engine spooled up to takeoff power. The Boeing 737 accelerated down the runway with increasing speed as Elena made tiny corrections to keep them perfectly aligned with the centerline, her feet dancing on the rudder pedals with the light touch of someone who had performed takeoffs countless times in aircraft far more demanding than the stable commercial jet beneath her. At rotation speed she pulled back gently on the control column and the aircraft lifted into the morning sky with textbook precision, climbing smoothly as the landing gear retracted and the flaps came up on schedule. Marcus called out airspeeds and altitudes while monitoring the engine instruments, and Elena acknowledged each call-out while flying the departure procedure with careful attention to the published routing and altitude restrictions that govern traffic flow in the congested airspace around the airport. As they climbed through 10,000 feet and the workload decreased slightly, Marcus began offering advice about managing passenger comfort during turbulence and suggested that Elena might want to keep the seatbelt sign illuminated longer than necessary during this flight given the weather forecasts ahead. He explained in a fatherly tone that newer captains sometimes felt pressure to turn off the seatbelt sign quickly to avoid passenger complaints, but that safety should always take priority over convenience even if it meant dealing with frustrated travelers who wanted to move around the cabin. Elena thanked him for the guidance while privately remembering missions where she had kept fighter jets flying through conditions that would have torn apart most aircraft, maintaining control through violent maneuvers and extreme G-forces that pushed the limits of both machine and pilot endurance. The idea that she might need reminders about prioritizing safety over comfort was almost amusing, but she appreciated Marcus's good intentions even if his assumptions about her experience were completely wrong. The flight continued smoothly for the first hour as they cruised at 35,000 feet through clear skies, but the weather radar ahead began showing increasingly angry patches of red and yellow that indicated building storm activity along their route. Marcus pointed at the radar display and suggested they request a deviation to the north where the returns looked slightly less intense, explaining that experienced pilots always tried to avoid the worst weather rather than challenging it directly. Elena studied the radar carefully while considering multiple factors including fuel reserves, alternate airports, and the structural capabilities of their aircraft. her tactical mind automatically running through contingency scenarios and risk assessments that went far beyond standard commercial aviation decision-making. She agreed that a northern deviation made sense from a passenger comfort perspective, and she requested the routing change from air traffic control with clear professional communication that made the controller respond immediately with approval and new heading instructions. The deviation took them slightly off course but appeared to route around the most intense weather cells visible on radar, and Marcus relaxed slightly as he commented that making good decisions about weather avoidance was one of the most important skills for airline captains to develop. Elena nodded agreement while keeping her attention focused on the evolving weather situation ahead, noting that the storm system was developing faster than the forecasts had predicted and that the gaps between cells were beginning to close up. Her mental calculations told her they might not be able to avoid significant turbulence even with the deviation, and she began mentally preparing for the possibility of flying through conditions that would test both the aircraft and the passengers' nerves. Marcus seemed unaware of how quickly the situation was deteriorating, his decades of commercial flying experience creating confidence based on the belief that modern weather radar and careful routing could usually keep them away from truly dangerous conditions. 20 minutes later the aircraft suddenly jolted as they encountered the leading edge of turbulence that the radar had failed to show clearly. The Boeing 737 bounced and shuddered as invisible atmospheric forces grabbed the wings and fuselage, and Marcus quickly reached for the public address microphone to tell the flight attendants to take their seats immediately. Elena's hands moved instinctively to the controls with responses that came from deep muscle memory built during countless hours of flying through conditions far worse than simple turbulence, her grip firm but relaxed as she made continuous tiny adjustments to maintain altitude and heading through the rough air. The turbulence intensified rapidly from moderate to severe, and the aircraft began experiencing violent vertical movements that threw anything unsecured around the cabin and caused several passengers to cry out in fear. Marcus's voice tightened with concern as he suggested they should request an immediate altitude change to find smoother air, his experience telling him that this level of turbulence was becoming dangerous for both the aircraft structure and passenger safety. Elena was already ahead of his suggestion and keyed the radio to request clearance for a climb to 37,000 feet where the weather radar showed a possible gap in the worst turbulence. Air traffic control approved the climb immediately, and Elena began a careful ascent while fighting the severe turbulence that was now throwing the aircraft around with forces that exceeded anything Marcus had experienced in his entire commercial aviation career. The businessman, and who had complained about Elena's youth earlier, was now gripping his armrests with white knuckles while his earlier confidence about knowing better than the airline completely vanished in the face of the terrifying reality unfolding around him. Flight attendants strapped themselves into jump seats while trying to calm passengers who were convinced they were going to die, and the cabin filled with the sounds of crying children, praying adults, and the constant creaking and groaning of the aircraft structure being stressed by the violent atmospheric conditions. The climb to 37,000 feet brought no relief as the turbulence actually intensified even further, and Elena realized with cold tactical clarity that they had flown into a developing severe thunderstorm cell that was producing conditions far more dangerous than anything standard commercial aviation training prepared pilots to handle. The aircraft was being thrown up and down with violent forces that made the instruments difficult to read, and Marcus was now openly afraid as he gripped his seat while calling out altitude deviations that exceeded 1,000 feet in seconds. Elena's fighter pilot training took over completely as she stopped treating the situation like a commercial aviation emergency and started flying the aircraft like a combat mission where survival depended on skills that went far beyond what civilian pilots ever learned. Her control inputs became more aggressive and tactical as she used techniques designed for controlling unstable fighter jets in extreme conditions, applying power and pitch changes that seemed counterintuitive but actually worked with the turbulent forces rather than fighting against them. Marcus watched in shocked amazement as Elena somehow maintained enough control to keep them roughly on heading and altitude despite turbulence that should have been completely overwhelming for any pilot to manage effectively. Her face showed intense concentration but no panic, and her hands moved across the controls with precision that seemed impossible given how violently the aircraft was being thrown around by forces that felt strong enough to tear the wings off. The aircraft suddenly dropped what felt like 2,000 feet in seconds as they hit a massive downdraft, and Marcus shouted something about declaring an emergency, but Elena was already 3 steps ahead as she simultaneously fought the descent, adjusted power settings, and keyed the radio to inform air traffic control that Flight 847 was encountering severe turbulence and needed priority handling for an immediate descent and diversion to the nearest suitable airport. Air traffic control responded urgently and began clearing other traffic from their path while offering vectors to multiple nearby airports, but before the controller could finish providing options, a different voice cut into the frequency with military authority that instantly changed the entire dynamic of the situation. The voice identified itself as Major Ryan Blackwell, F-16 Fighting Falcon commander from the 55th Fighter Squadron conducting training operations in the area, and he requested confirmation of the civilian aircraft's tail number and captain's identity. Elena felt her stomach tighten as she realized military aircraft were monitoring the frequency and had somehow identified her aircraft, but she had no choice except to respond professionally while still fighting the violent turbulence that continued to throw them around like a toy. She confirmed the aircraft tail number and identified herself as Captain Elena Rodriguez, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding her as years of military discipline overrode any personal concerns about her hidden background being revealed. There was a brief pause on the frequency before Major Blackwell's voice returned with a tone that Marcus immediately recognized as carrying profound military respect that went far beyond normal communication protocols between military and civilian aircraft. The F-16 commander spoke with formal precision as he said that he had confirmed her identity through military databases and wanted to acknowledge her presence in their training airspace, and then he added words that would change everything for everyone listening on that frequency. His voice carried unmistakable reverence as he transmitted clearly for all to hear that he was honored to have Lieutenant Colonel Elena Viper Rodriguez flying through their airspace, and he formally welcomed her back with the words that military personnel reserved only for distinguished officers who had earned legendary status through extraordinary service and achievement. He said with perfect military protocol and genuine respect, "Welcome back, ma'am." The impact of those words hit Marcus like a physical blow as he suddenly understood that the young woman sitting next to him was not a newly promoted commercial captain learning to handle challenging situations but rather a highly decorated military officer whose rank and call sign indicated elite fighter pilot credentials that exceeded anything he had imagined possible. Lieutenant Colonel was a senior rank that required years of exceptional service to achieve, and having an F-16 squadron commander address her with such formal respect meant she had accomplished things during her military career that earned recognition from the most skilled fighter pilots in the Air Force. Marcus stared at Elena with completely new understanding as questions flooded his mind about who she really was and what she had done during her military service that would make a combat veteran like Major Blackwell greet her with words normally reserved for legendary aviators whose reputations preceded them. Elena had no time to address Marcus's shock because the turbulence suddenly intensified even beyond what they had already experienced, and the aircraft began encountering wind shear and downdrafts that created conditions more dangerous than anything she had faced during combat missions over hostile territory. The Boeing 737 was being pushed beyond its designed operating envelope as forces exceeded the structural limits that civilian aircraft were built to handle during normal operations, and Elena knew they were seconds away from either breaking apart in midair or losing so much altitude that recovery would become impossible. Her fighter pilot training became her only hope for survival as she stopped flying like a commercial pilot following standard procedures and started flying like a combat aviator fighting for life against an enemy that happened to be weather instead of weapons. She pushed the throttles forward to maximum power while simultaneously pushing the nose down into a descent that seemed suicidal but actually used gravity and airspeed to punch through the worst downdrafts instead of being carried helplessly downward by forces too strong to resist. Marcus shouted that she was diving too steeply and that they needed to pull up immediately, but Elena ignored his panicked advice because she knew exactly what she was doing based on experience that Marcus could never understand. The airspeed increased rapidly as they descended at angles that would normally trigger every warning system in the cockpit, but Elena kept her focus locked on the instruments while making continuous control adjustments that kept the aircraft flying despite conditions that would have caused most pilots to lose control completely. The turbulence began to decrease slightly as they punched through the worst part of the storm cell, and Elena gradually reduced the descent rate while bringing the power back to normal climb settings. Within 60 seconds they had fought their way clear of the most dangerous turbulence and were flying in rough but manageable conditions that felt almost calm compared to what they had just survived. Major Blackwell's voice came back on the frequency asking if they required any assistance, and Elena responded that they had successfully navigated through the severe weather and were now requesting vectors to the nearest airport for immediate landing so they could assess any potential damage to the aircraft and check on passenger welfare. The F-16 commander acknowledged her request and coordinated directly with air traffic control to give Flight 847 priority handling and direct routing to a military airfield only 40 miles away that had better weather conditions and longer runways than the civilian airports in the immediate area. He added that emergency response teams would be standing by when they landed and that he was personally authorizing them to use military facilities given the severity of the situation they had just encountered. Elena thanked him professionally while beginning her approach preparations, her hands already moving through checklists and procedures with the automatic precision that came from years of training for emergency situations. Marcus was still processing everything that had happened while trying to understand who Elena really was beneath the surface of the young commercial pilot he had assumed needed his guidance and mentorship. He finally found his voice and asked directly what her call sign, Viper, meant and what she had done during her military career that would earn such respect from an F-16 squadron commander. Elena kept her focus on flying the approach while she briefly explained that she had spent 8 years as a fighter pilot flying combat missions in multiple theaters of operation, and that she had eventually commanded her own squadron before choosing to retire from military service and pursue a quieter career in commercial aviation. She didn't elaborate on the specific missions or achievements that had earned her legendary status within the military aviation community, but Marcus understood enough to realize he had been flying with someone whose skills and experience exceeded his own by orders of magnitude despite her youthful appearance suggesting otherwise. The approach to the military airfield proceeded smoothly as Elena brought the Boeing 737 down through the clouds with precision that reflected thousands of hours of landing experience in conditions ranging from calm to impossible. The passengers remained quiet and shaken in the cabin, unaware that the terrifying turbulence encounter that nearly killed them all had been survived only because their young pilot possessed extraordinary abilities that went far beyond normal commercial aviation training. Elena configured the aircraft for landing while running through approach checklists with Marcus, who now assisted her with new appreciation and respect for the capabilities she had hidden behind her friendly professional demeanor. The runway appeared ahead through the clearing weather, and Elena flew a perfect approach that touched down smoothly despite crosswinds that still lingered from the storm system they had fought through at altitude. Emergency vehicles followed them as Elena taxied clear of the runway and parked the aircraft near the military terminal where ground crews were already positioning equipment to assist passengers during deplaning procedures. She completed the shutdown checklist with Marcus while the cabin crew began explaining to confused and frightened passengers that they had diverted to a military facility for safety reasons but that buses would transport everyone to the civilian airport to complete their journey on another aircraft. The cabin door opened and military personnel boarded to assist with passenger handling, and Elena stood up from the captain's seat to stretch muscles that were tight from the intense concentration required during the emergency. Marcus looked at her with completely new eyes and said quietly that he had been patronizing her throughout the flight by offering advice and assuming she needed guidance, and he apologized sincerely for not recognizing that she possessed experience and capabilities far beyond what her appearance suggested. Elena accepted his apology graciously and explained that she had deliberately chosen not to advertise her military background because she wanted to succeed as a commercial pilot on her own merits rather than relying on her previous reputation and service record. She said she appreciated his patience and professional attitude even when he had mistakenly believed she needed mentorship, and she assured him that his advice about passenger management and airline procedures had actually been valuable since those aspects of commercial aviation were genuinely new to her despite her extensive flying experience in other contexts. Marcus smiled with obvious relief that she wasn't offended by his earlier assumptions, and he admitted that watching her fly through that severe turbulence had been both terrifying and amazing because he had never seen anyone control an aircraft with such precision and tactical skill under conditions that would have overwhelmed most pilots. The passengers began deplaning with shaky legs and profound relief at being safely on the ground after the traumatic experience at altitude. Many of them looked at Elena with new confusion as they passed through the cockpit area, clearly struggling to understand how the young pilot they had doubted before takeoff had somehow managed to save their lives when conditions became deadly. The businessman who had complained loudest about her age stopped at the cockpit door and awkwardly admitted that he owed her an apology for questioning her capabilities based solely on her appearance, and he thanked her with genuine emotion for bringing them down safely through conditions that he was certain would have crashed the aircraft with anyone else flying. Elena accepted his thanks with quiet dignity and simply said she had done her job exactly as she was trained to do, leaving out any mention of what that training had actually involved. Major Blackwell arrived at the aircraft 20 minutes later after landing his F-16 and shutting down at the fighter ramp on the opposite side of the airfield. He was a tall officer in his early 40s with the confident bearing of someone who had spent 2 decades flying the most demanding missions the Air Force could assign, and his eyes showed immediate recognition and respect when he saw Elena standing near the aircraft in her commercial pilot uniform. He approached with military formality and extended his hand while addressing her by rank rather than her civilian title, acknowledging Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez with the respect that her service record commanded. Elena shook his hand and thanked him for his assistance during the emergency, and Major Blackwell replied that any aviator would have helped in that situation but that he had been honored to provide support to someone whose reputation within the fighter pilot community made her a legend among legends. Marcus listened to their conversation with growing amazement as pieces of Elena's hidden background began to emerge through the professional military discussion between 2 combat veterans who shared experiences and perspectives that civilian pilots could never fully understand. Major Blackwell mentioned that he had studied several of her combat missions during advanced tactical training, and that the maneuvers she had executed during those missions had become teaching examples for how to accomplish seemingly impossible objectives against overwhelming odds. He said with genuine admiration that every fighter pilot in the Air Force knew the call sign Viper, and the stories about her capabilities that sometimes seemed too extraordinary to believe until you actually saw her flying record and confirmed that everything you heard was absolutely true. Elena looked slightly uncomfortable with the praise and said simply that she had done what needed to be done during difficult times, and that many other aviators had performed equally impressive feats during their own service. Major Blackwell smiled at her characteristic modesty and said that while many pilots performed admirably during combat operations, very few earned the Distinguished Flying Cross twice or commanded a squadron at age 27 or received personal commendations from 4-star generals for missions that remained classified even years after they occurred. Marcus felt his jaw drop as he processed those revelations and understood that Elena's military achievements went far beyond impressive into truly legendary territory that explained why an F-16 squadron commander would greet her with such profound respect and formal military protocol. The Distinguished Flying Cross was one of the highest decorations awarded for extraordinary heroism during flight operations, and receiving it twice indicated sustained excellence under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. Commanding a squadron in her 20s meant the Air Force had recognized exceptional leadership abilities that normally took decades to develop, and classified missions suggested involvement in operations at the highest levels of national security. The conversation shifted to the specific turbulence encounter as Major Blackwell asked Elena for her assessment of the conditions they had flown through and whether the commercial aircraft had sustained any damage from the extreme forces encountered at altitude. Elena described the situation professionally while explaining the techniques she had used to maintain control when standard procedures became inadequate for the severity of the weather conditions. Major Blackwell nodded with understanding as she detailed using fighter pilot approaches to managing the unstable aircraft, and he commented that her decision to execute an aggressive descent through the downdrafts rather than trying to climb above them showed tactical thinking that probably saved the aircraft from structural failure. He added that maintenance teams would perform detailed inspections before the Boeing 737 returned to service, but that based on her description of events he suspected she had kept the forces within acceptable limits despite how severe the encounter must have felt for everyone aboard. Marcus finally found his voice and asked Elena directly why she had left military aviation to become a commercial pilot when she clearly had capabilities and a career path that could have taken her to the highest levels of military leadership. Elena was quiet for a moment before answering honestly that 8 years of combat operations and constant high-stress missions had taken their toll on her in ways that weren't immediately visible but that affected her deeply nonetheless. She explained that she had loved flying fighters and serving her country, but that she had eventually realized she needed to step away from that intensity before it consumed everything else in her life. Commercial aviation had offered a way to continue doing what she loved while removing the constant pressure and danger that came with military flying, and she had accepted the trade-off of flying slower, less exciting aircraft in exchange for a lifestyle that allowed her to maintain her passion for aviation without sacrificing her personal well-being. Major Blackwell understood completely because he had seen many excellent pilots reach similar conclusions during his years of service, and he respected her decision to prioritize her long-term health over the ego satisfaction that came from flying the hottest aircraft on the most challenging missions. He said that the Air Force missed having her in the cockpit, but that her contributions during her years of service had more than earned her the right to choose whatever path forward made sense for her life. Elena thanked him for his understanding and mentioned that she occasionally missed the adrenaline and challenge of fighter flying, but that overall she felt satisfied with her decision to transition to commercial aviation even when it meant dealing with passengers and colleagues who underestimated her abilities based on her youthful appearance. The airline sent representatives to the military base to coordinate passenger transportation and aircraft recovery, and several company officials specifically sought out Elena to discuss what had happened during the flight. When they reviewed the cockpit voice recordings and flight data, the technical experts were stunned by what they found because the recorded parameters showed the aircraft had been subjected to forces and conditions far beyond normal commercial operations, yet Elena had maintained control throughout the entire emergency with skills that seemed impossible based on her relatively short time with the airline. One senior captain who had 40 years of flying experience admitted after reviewing the data that he would not have survived the turbulence encounter because the control inputs required went far beyond anything taught in commercial aviation training programs. Word spread rapidly through the airline about what had actually happened aboard Flight 847, and Elena's hidden military background became known throughout the pilot community despite her preference for maintaining privacy about her previous career. Pilots who had viewed her as just another young captain suddenly realized they had been flying with someone whose experience and capabilities exceeded most of theirs combined, and the skepticism she had faced about her age transformed into widespread respect and curiosity about her service record. The businessman who had complained about her youth contacted the airline's customer service department specifically to commend Elena's professionalism and skill, and he mentioned in his letter that she had saved his life and everyone else aboard through flying abilities that he now understood came from elite military training rather than standard pilot certification programs. Marcus remained amazed by everything he had learned during the emergency, and he told Elena privately that he would never again make assumptions about someone's capabilities based solely on their appearance or what he thought their experience level should be. Elena appreciated his honesty and said that his willingness to learn from the experience showed good character, and she suggested they could both benefit from flying together in the future since his commercial aviation expertise complemented her military flying background in ways that made them an effective crew despite their different backgrounds. Marcus agreed enthusiastically and said he would be honored to fly with her again, though he promised to skip the patronizing advice next time since he now understood that she probably had more experience with challenging flying situations than anyone else in the entire airline. The passengers eventually continued their journey to Denver on another aircraft while Elena remained at the military base to coordinate with maintenance teams inspecting the Boeing 737 for potential damage from the turbulence encounter. Major Blackwell invited her to visit the fighter squadron and meet some of the younger pilots who would be thrilled to talk with someone whose reputation preceded her, but Elena politely declined by explaining that she was trying to maintain clear separation between her military past and commercial present. She appreciated his invitation and thanked him again for his assistance during the emergency, and Major Blackwell respected her decision while saying that the fighter pilot community would always consider her one of their own regardless of what aircraft she currently flew. As Elena prepared to catch a flight back to her home base, she reflected on how the day's events had forced her hidden background into the open despite her careful efforts to keep her military service private. She had wanted to succeed as a commercial pilot on her own merits without relying on her distinguished service record, but the severe turbulence emergency had required her to use skills that could only have come from elite fighter pilot training. The situation had revealed her true identity to everyone aboard Flight 847 and would inevitably spread throughout the airline despite her preference for privacy, but she accepted that some secrets were impossible to maintain when circumstances demanded capabilities that went far beyond normal qualifications. Looking back at the military airfield as her taxi drove toward the civilian terminal, Elena felt mixed emotions about returning to commercial flying after the intense experience of using her fighter pilot skills during a genuine emergency. Part of her missed the challenge and adrenaline of military aviation where every flight pushed her capabilities to their limits, but another part remembered why she had chosen to step away from that world in search of a more balanced and sustainable career path. The day's events had proven that her decision to leave military flying hadn't diminished her skills or dulled her tactical edge, and knowing that she could still perform at the highest level when required gave her confidence that she had made the right choice even if it meant accepting the occasional frustration of being underestimated based on her appearance. The airline formally recognized Elena's exceptional performance during Flight 847's emergency by presenting her with their highest safety award at a ceremony attended by company leadership and dozens of pilots who wanted to acknowledge her achievement. Elena accepted the award with characteristic modesty and used her speech to emphasize that safety always required pilots to maintain their skills at the highest possible level regardless of what type of flying they did on a daily basis. She mentioned that her military training had certainly helped during the severe turbulence encounter, but that any well-trained pilot could have handled the situation by focusing on fundamental flying skills and maintaining calm under pressure. Some pilots in the audience smiled knowingly because they had reviewed the flight data and understood that Elena's description significantly understated what had actually been required to survive conditions that would have overwhelmed almost anyone else. Marcus became one of Elena's strongest advocates within the airline, and he made sure to correct anyone who expressed doubts about young pilots or suggested that experience could be judged solely by appearance rather than demonstrated capabilities and performance. He told the story of flying with Lieutenant Colonel Viper Rodriguez through severe turbulence that nearly destroyed their aircraft, and how her fighter pilot skills had saved everyone aboard while he watched in amazed helplessness from the right seat. His accounts helped change attitudes throughout the airline about making assumptions based on superficial characteristics, and several senior captains privately admitted they had learned valuable lessons about recognizing that exceptional ability could come in unexpected packages that didn't fit traditional expectations. Elena gradually became more comfortable with her military background being known within the airline community, and she occasionally shared insights from her extensive fighter pilot experience during training sessions and safety briefings. She emphasized that the same tactical thinking and situational awareness that kept fighter pilots alive during combat missions could also improve safety and decision-making in commercial aviation, and younger pilots found her perspectives valuable for developing their own skills and judgment. She remained humble about her achievements while acknowledging that her military service had given her capabilities that proved valuable when circumstances demanded performance beyond standard operating procedures. The passengers from Flight 847 never forgot their brush with disaster at 35,000 feet or the young pilot who looked too young to be trusted but turned out to be exactly the right person they needed flying their aircraft when conditions became deadly. Several of them wrote personal letters to Elena thanking her for saving their lives, and more than a few admitted feeling ashamed about doubting her capabilities before takeoff based solely on her youthful appearance. Elena responded graciously to each letter by saying she understood their initial concerns and held no grudges about skepticism that came from natural protective instincts rather than malicious intent toward her personally. The businessman who had demanded to speak with a supervisor before takeoff became one of Elena's most vocal supporters, and he told everyone about the experience of nearly dying before being saved by a legendary fighter pilot. His story spread through networks and social media, and Elena found herself becoming something of a minor celebrity despite her preference for privacy. She handled the attention with grace while redirecting focus toward the broader point that capabilities should be judged by demonstrated performance rather than superficial characteristics. Major Blackwell stayed in touch with Elena through occasional emails about aviation topics and transitioning between military and civilian flying careers. He mentioned that several younger pilots in his squadron had been inspired by her service record and her decision to pursue commercial aviation. Elena appreciated knowing her choices might help other aviators think more broadly about their options. 6 months after the emergency, Elena was promoted to check airman status within the airline based on her exceptional flying skills and growing reputation for excellence. The position allowed her to train and evaluate other pilots, and she approached the responsibility with dedication she had brought to commanding a fighter squadron years earlier. She found satisfaction in helping newer pilots develop their capabilities while sharing lessons from years of flying in demanding environments. The story of Captain Elena Viper Rodriguez and Flight 847 eventually became something of a legend within aviation circles, told and retold as an example of how appearances can deceive and how exceptional ability sometimes hides behind unexpected exteriors. Pilots shared the story. During training sessions to illustrate points about making good decisions under pressure and about recognizing that experience and capability take many forms beyond what conventional wisdom suggests. Elena herself remained humble about the entire episode while quietly appreciating that one severe turbulence encounter had taught everyone involved important lessons about assumptions, capabilities, and the value of judging people by their actions rather than their appearances. The elderly couple who had worried about Elena's youth before boarding Flight 847 wrote her a particularly touching letter months after the emergency, explaining that they had spent their whole lives making snap judgments about people based on superficial characteristics and that nearly dying while being saved by someone they had unfairly doubted had taught them to approach others with more open minds and fewer preconceptions. Elena kept that letter in her flight bag as a reminder that even difficult experiences could produce positive outcomes when people remained willing to learn and grow from circumstances that challenged their existing assumptions and beliefs. Flying commercial routes through routine skies would never match the intensity of combat missions or the satisfaction of executing perfect tactics against skilled opponents, but Elena found genuine fulfillment in knowing that her daily work kept hundreds of passengers safe while allowing her to maintain the passion for aviation that had defined her life since childhood. Lieutenant Colonel Elena Viper Rodriguez continued flying commercial aircraft for years to come, building a reputation as one of the finest captains in the airline while never forgetting the military service that shaped her capabilities and the fighter pilot community that would always consider her one of their own regardless of what aircraft she flew or uniform she wore.